a glass to the past, and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bottle said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It is time once again to pour up a glass and to pull up a chair as we gather together right here in our very favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub. And as always, exploring lost chasms, secret tunnels, and ancient monuments to the builders of times long gone by. Welcome, welcome one and all, and happy holidays. Glad to be here with you. We have our wreaths around in preparation, of course, of the holiday, the festivity of feasting, known as Thanksgiving. James and Jason, sirs, good to see you here. I hope you're both in equal holiday-adorned spirits.
Well, I certainly am. You know, it's my favorite time of the year. Everybody loves fall. I particularly love fall. You know, one thing that I don't necessarily love, fellas, is the fact that every 4 or 5 years, my birthday happens to fall on Thanksgiving Day. And that is the case this year. So I guess, once again, as it often is, birthday cake and turkey. I guess it's not the worst combination in the world.
No, but, happy thanks birthday. I don't necessarily have those problems. And we're kind of in between on our decorations this year. I would say we're somewhere between remnants of Halloween and the beginnings of fall decorations. But that's Danielle's department.
Jason and James, I just lump it all into one thing around this time of the year. I just put pumpkins out for Thanksgiving, but I put them out before Halloween, right? That's my strategy. And that way, the pumpkins look wonderful all throughout autumn, at least until the black bears, the raccoons, and the possums begin making their way onto my porch at night. Those thieving little louts, stealing my pumpkins, my gourds, and other things that I put out there to adorn my home and make it look a little bit more in keeping with the autumn season. But yeah, I just kind of throw it all together. You're likely to still see some pumpkins as Christmas approaches around the Hanctus Hanctorum here in the mountains. So, speaking of those ancient sacred sites, you guys may have recently seen that the former Antiquities Minister of Egypt, Zahi Hawass, has been teasing a major announcement for early 2026. As you probably both know, Egyptian archaeology and really ancient monumental structures and those very enigmatic mysteries of the ancient world. I mean, that's a particular interest of mine when it comes to archaeology. And so I always keep an ear to the ground as far as what is happening over there in the land of the pharaohs. But Zahi Hawass is making some big claims. He is saying, and indeed, let's hope that this all plays out to our expectations, but he's saying this is going to be something that literally rewrites the history of Egypt as we know it. And he has teased that this has something to do with a long kind of a passageway or shaft that has been discovered in in the Great Pyramid. And I suspect this probably has to do with the ongoing project known as the Scan Pyramids Project. I'm sure you gents are familiar with it, right?
Yeah, I'm familiar with it. And honestly, I thought you were going to say that he teased that they're going to finally make the announcement that they discovered the labyrinth.
No, not that. I've been tracking the labyrinth discovery as well, although there's been a lot of buzz about the discovery of the Egyptians' labyrinth. Now, the Greeks had a labyrinth as well. 2 different labyrinths. Actually, there are probably competing labyrinth sites or proposed labyrinth sites on the island of Crete alone. So there's a lot of question about where the labyrinths of the ancient world existed, whether there was one in ancient Greece. That's a whole nother discussion for another time. I recently talked about that on one of my podcasts. But no, Zahi, of course, is saying that there is a new discovery within the Great Pyramid that he says is going to be big news. And again, he's already kind of alluded to what this is. It does involve what I believe is the ongoing muon tomography. These muon tomographic studies, I guess is how you would phrase that, are allowing us to essentially remote sense the insides of the pyramid without being invasive and going in like Howard Weiss used to do way back in the day, He'd go in there with hammers and with TNT, blast out holes, crawl through them, find hidden chambers, and quite literally blast his way through the pyramid. So again, I guess the antiquities ministry in Egypt is glad people no longer do things that way. And this is, again, a contentious issue. It's been an ongoing one. Egypt recently also opened its Grand Museum, and there are current efforts to try and repatriate a lot of those Egyptian artifacts that are now in museums all around the world because they were collected by those antiquarians, especially during the 19th century. There's a lot going on, but again, I think that Zahi, in addition to trying to reclaim some of the wonder and bring that back to Egypt, he's also trying to promote some new discoveries. But he's also teased for a long time his hope of finding the graves of, for instance, Imhotep, the original builder of what first were step pyramids in the early dynastic period, but later, which of course served as the template for the more elaborate structures that became known as the Great Pyramids at Giza. Zahi has been searching for the grave of that builder. He's also been searching for the grave of Nefertiti. And so these are among the things that he is always teasing, and he says he has an idea of where at least one of those graves may be. I saw a headline the other day talking about Zahi's recent pronouncements, and it literally led off with, "This had better be good." Because again, there's often a lot of talk and a little less in the way of delivery. So indeed, I am eager to see if in early 2026 we have a major landmark discovery, or if indeed it's just an incremental inching toward a broader understanding of ancient Egyptian history. But guys, in a whole different part of the world, and I have to bring this one to your attention as well, there have been a lot of discoveries recently related to the ancient Silk Road. Have you guys noticed this?
I have seen the search term come up quite a bit lately, yes.
Right. Smithsonian had an article about this, and in fact, that one had relationship to a study that came out much earlier this year, Jason. That was from March or April, and it was discussing a discovery of a well-known city from history. They now think that an archaeological site relates to this, but I was intrigued to find that coinciding with reporting on that discovery from earlier this year was a lesser-known discovery. And this one has a lot to do with ongoing efforts by the Russian Geographic Society in cooperation with a few other institutes of archaeology in Russia. And they say that in autumn of this year, so this is a fairly recent discovery, only now starting to get out, that within the world's 11th largest lake, but I think the 8th deepest in the world, they have discovered a series of medieval structures and what they describe as the remains of a Islamic mosque. And this is in Kazakhstan, but they say that this medieval series of structures weren't originally under the water. What happened was in the 15th century, there was a massive earthquake that struck that region, and it caused portions that were alongside the water to actually go down into this lake. And so now they're going down, they're doing underwater archaeology, and from past discussions we've had with Jesse Halligan and others, we know how complex underwater archaeology can be. But they're going down, they had 4 target locations, and in a couple they're finding the remains of structures, in a few they're finding burials. Some of the burials are showing these characteristic signs of having been related to the religion of Islam because they are pointed in certain directions. Others seem to be from different eras, and putting 2 and 2 together, this seems to suggest, okay, different occupation over time. It's probably a location that was a trade hub. It was very active during the Middle Ages. My gosh, this is probably a lost site from the Silk Road. It's lost because it's been in this huge lake now for centuries, and at one of the locations that they dove into and they were exploring underwater, they found, they say, the remains of this ancient Islamic necropolis, ancient again by medieval standards. So it's quite a massive discovery to be found in this huge lake in a fairly remote part of the world as well, but one that is further expanding our knowledge of that ancient trade route between central China and the eastern Mediterranean, which we have a lot of historical information about. I mean, case in point, in order to confirm what they had found at this now submerged archaeological site in Kazakhstan, they went to Chinese historical records, and lo and behold, there are references in those writings to this site, which again has only now been rediscovered since it sunk beneath the waves quite literally in the 15th century. So I just think that's fascinating how there's almost this tendency for there to be multiple discoveries within a singular genre. Jason, I think we've seen this with the Clovis technologies and things like that here in America. And all of a sudden, a series of discussions or discoveries will start to come to pass all around the same time that suddenly expand our knowledge significantly. And it seems like that could be happening with regard to some of our inquiries into the archaeology of the Silk Road.
You know, one of the things that's interesting about that from a non-archaeological perspective, but from a geologic perspective, when you have an earthquake situation where you have an area that subsides, now I don't know this specifically about this, but it's probably a situation what's called normal faulting, right? There's all kinds of different faults, how the earth moves in different ways. Like in Southern California, the plates are moving past each other. But in this case, if you've got a big block that moves down relative to the surrounding terrain, that's called normal faulting. And it's just basically a kind of an expansion of the earth where it kind of stretches out just slightly, and it causes these blocks just to drop down. And it's almost never caught on camera, but there's been a couple of times, and I think there was one recently somewhere in Southeast Asia where they caught this actually happening on camera for the first time ever. We've never seen it before. We know it does it because you can go out and measure it in the environment, but sometimes it happens on these almost like a regional scale where you have this huge area that just moves down slightly 10, 15 feet. And then what's it do? Fills up with water.
Yeah.
Right?
I mean, it's interesting because it almost makes you wonder about some of the ancient mythologies involving sunken cities and things, Atlantis, of course, being one that comes to mind. Is it possible that people in the ancient world found the remnants of sunken cities and they're like, oh, wow, there's water here where there once was a city? And in fact, geological processes like what you're describing might account for that. Just speculating. In some instances, of course, we know that happens. Volcanism, earthquakes, and other kinds of catastrophic events, they can certainly remove land, or they can place things that were once on land, in different locations, namely underwater. But this is just fascinating that, again, we are engaging in this archaeological process of reclaiming some of this and learning about these ancient sites. And in fact, I'm sure that our friends, our colleagues, our listeners are learning a lot right now in attendance over there at Seven Ages University with Jason Pentrail and the Green Dragon Book Club. What's going on over there on Patreon, my man?
Well, we are continuing to get new material. We've got a lot coming up. We've got a few new guests coming to the show here in the next month or so. We've got new episodes of the Green Dragon Book Club as well as the Digging Deeper podcast. So, yeah, we've got new people, new guests, and lots of new interviews. A little bit of a lull here at the holidays as people are off with their families and busy, but we will certainly be kicking it off with full force January of 2026. And then, of course, over on our TeePublic site, which is our merchandising site for the Seven Ages Audio Journal, all of those items are there for the holiday season, your t-shirts, your mugs, anything that you could possibly want with Seven Ages logos on it, about 8 different designs to choose from. And of course, you can always find those links in the show notes for each and every one of these episodes.
That sounds splendid indeed. Check all that out at sevenages.org. And of course, in the show notes on your podcasting app. But as far as what we have in store for tonight, I do believe that ever intriguing, at times contentious, but incredibly important discussion within archaeology of NAGPRA is on the table. Am I right? Jason, fill me in.
That is correct. This is a topic that has been requested by listeners for quite a few years now, and also archaeologists in our community. We've had several people reach out to us over the last couple of years and ask that we cover this topic because it is vitally important to archaeology, and it's certainly something that has been in focus in the media in the last few years. So we wanted to make sure that everybody understood it. In this particular episode, we have Spencer Pelton, who is the Wyoming State Archaeologist, along with Robert Kelly, Professor Emeritus from the University of Wyoming. Both of these gentlemen sat down and had a very detailed discussion with me concerning the ins and outs of NAGPRA. And really the purpose of this episode is the history and intent. Where did this come from and where is it at today after a few changes that have happened in the last couple of years? Very informative. And if you're someone who loves archaeology, also people visiting museums who may have questions about some of the displays and where some of those items may be going, we cover all of those issues in this very special episode on NAGPRA, which again is very important to the world and to the future of archaeology.
Absolutely. So Robert and Spencer joining us here. This conversation Jason leads is going to be one for the books, no doubt, when we return right here in a moment on the 7AGES Audio Journal.
It's my pleasure today to welcome to the show Robert L. Kelly and Spencer Pelton. Now, Dr. Kelly is an internationally known authority on the archaeology and ethnology of hunting and gathering societies. He has participated in research projects in Western North America since 1973. He is a past president of the Society of American Archaeology 2001 to 2003 and past editor of the Society's flagship journal American Antiquity 2015 to 2018. We also welcome back to the show Dr. Spencer Pelton. He is the Wyoming State Archaeologist and an adjunct professor of anthropology at the University of Wyoming. Spencer has maintained a varied career in federal and state government, private and academic sectors, working in Tennessee, North Carolina, California, Nevada, Colorado, and Wyoming during his 17-plus year career. So we're excited to have both of them joining us here today for a very special and in-depth conversation on the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which we will refer to for the remainder of the show as NAGPRA. This is 25 U.S. Code Chapter 32. This is something that has been requested by you, the listener, on many occasions. It can often be confusing, in-depth type of act, has lots of moving parts and things that are changing as we speak. So we're going to get into the details of this, help you understand it, both from the archaeologist standpoint, the government standpoint, and the tribal standpoint, so that hopefully by the end of this ongoing series, there will at least be 2 parts, maybe more, depending on the depth of the conversation, that we will be able to educate all of the listeners and help you understand the ins and outs of this. As listeners, I know many of you have been going to some of the sites, some of the museums, and writing in with questions as to why some of the cases may be empty, why some of the things are now being represented as reproductions. We'll get into all of that at some point during this ongoing series, but right now we want to cover the history and the intent of NAGPRA. So how did we get here, and what is the aim of this act? So again, we welcome Dr. Robert Kelly and Spencer. Thank you both for joining us here today.
Jason?
Thank you, Jason.
Well, again, this is it's a big topic. It's one that's hard to tackle in many ways. The show's been going for about 8 years now, and in about the last 4 or 5 years, we really saw an increase in traffic with people asking questions about NAGPRA. They want to know how archaeology is changing, how museum studies are changing, how the display of Native American funerary and human remains, those type of objects are changing and being addressed. And this is the act, again, 25 U.S. Code Chapter 32, that has been established in order to deal with some of those things. So we want to begin tonight with how did we get to this point? So Dr. Kelly, I'm going to come to you first. Now, you have an extensive amount of experience in anthropology and archaeology. You've seen many changes over the years. And so the first question would be, before we get into what NAGPRA is, how are things like human remains, funerary objects, relations with tribal members dealt with in the past prior to 1990 when NAGPRA was officially passed?
NAGPRA actually has a very lengthy history to it that concerns the relationship between the indigenous peoples of the United States and the United States government. And it really goes back to the 1906 Antiquities Act, which was an act written originally to preserve archaeological sites and protect them from looting, and protect them from looting from outsiders. It was generated by a Swedish man's basically looting of the so-called cliff dwellings in what's now Mesa Verde National Park. All of that material, incidentally, that he took is still in a museum in Finland, which used to be part of Sweden. and I've seen much of that material. But the Antiquities Act was passed in order to prevent that sort of thing from happening, and it actually got expanded to include not just archaeological sites, but any sort of interesting geological or natural feature. So the first monument that was created under the Antiquities Act is Devil's Tower in Wyoming, known as Bears Lodge to most tribes. And that was the beginning of legislation that was designed really to protect archaeological sites. And there were a number of pieces of legislation passed since that time, especially in the 1960s. For example, a National Historic Preservation Act, National Environmental Protection Act as well, that were designed to protect archaeological sites. NAGPRA is a different kind of legislation. It's not intended to simply protect archaeological sites, but it's really viewed as human rights legislation. It was really the first piece of legislation that acknowledged that the indigenous peoples had a stake in archaeological sites, and it was a stake that was different than what archaeologists had. Archaeologists looked at them as sources of historical information, and many indigenous people saw that act as somewhat sacrilegious, desecrating the remains of the past, and especially human burials, because the human remains is an incredibly powerful symbol. Right now, well, for some number of years, the American military has been sending groups of people, including archaeologists, to try and recover individuals who were lost, American pilots who were downed in Vietnam or in World War II, bombers that crashed in Europe. They've been trying to recover those remains and repatriate them to the United States. So that attitude towards human burials is not unique to indigenous folks of North America. So there were a number of efforts made, really starting in the 1970s, in the state of Iowa. In 1976, Iowa passed a Burial Protection Act that was very, very simple, and it fell under a criminal mischief law. But it simply said that you can't intentionally excavate human remains without some kind of lawful permission. That was, to the best of my knowledge, Iowa was the first state to pass such an act. About 10 years later, in Kentucky, there was an incident where a Mississippian-era cemetery was being looted by individuals for private gain. They were looking for the pots in those burials and were selling them on the antiquities market. That raised quite an outcry in Kentucky. I lived there at the time, and it resulted in the passage of a state law very similar to Iowa's law, which basically says you cannot intentionally remove a human burial without some kind of lawful permission. Those are really some of the two early versions of this. By this time in the 1980s, the tribes had acquired enough political power and enough political savvy to know that they could fight some of the things that were going on. And one of those things was the recognition that there were thousands and thousands of human remains that were held by various kinds of organizations, especially museums and universities, that had been held there for many, many decades without really any input from tribe. And what really, I think, set things off was the recognition that there were, this is so rough to talk about, that there were actually decapitated heads that had been taken by the U.S. Army on battlefields from the 19th century. They had decapitated some of the fallen warriors and sent those heads back to the Smithsonian. and that they had been kept there. And this is just plain gruesome. And Walter Echohawk, a Pawnee lawyer, had worked very hard to bring this to the attention of both the public and the government. And it insisted that, look, we're not asking for anything other than to bury our dead. And that certainly resonated with plenty of people, including many members of Congress. So by the late 1980s, there were discussions held and various bills were proposed. Some of these didn't get out of committee. Some of them got out of committee and were passed by the House, but not by the Senate, or they never got to the floor for a vote until really 1989, when the NAGPRA bill, the version of NAGPRA that was finally passed, was initially proposed, I believe, by Representative Udall. And it was passed after lengthy, long discussions between tribes and tribal entities and various organizations like the Society for American Archaeology and museum associations, Society for Historic Archaeology, and the American Anthropological Association. There were a whole lot of organizations that commented on it for a number of years. And when NAGPRA was finally passed, all of those organizations wrote to President Bush urging him to sign it into law. They all agreed. The indigenous organizations, as well as the professional organizations as well, museums, all have signed on to it. Thought it was a necessary piece of human rights legislation. And it covered human remains, any funerary objects found with those human remains, as well as objects of cultural patrimony, which is a sort of broad case, but it included things that were objects that were very, very important to tribes that had been removed through nefarious means, and that was passed in 1990. And it's been the law of the land for the last 35 years. And there were archaeologists in the late 1980s who were adamantly opposed to this. But in my experience, I don't know an archaeologist who is adamantly opposed to NAGPRA. All of us have recognized that it was something that really had to be done. And it entails a loss of information for archaeologists because we have only scratched the surface of what we can learn from human remains. In 1990, the state of genetic analysis of human remains was nowhere near what it is today. But we've given all of that up because we saw it as a human rights issue, and it was the compromise that was struck between basically returning everything. We returned those things that were most crucial, and it's been, in my opinion, a good thing.
Jason, with just an anecdote, I do know a couple of archaeologists that are still opposed to the law itself. I'm not one of them. I've always supported the law itself, but my argument to them, and I think it tends to learn pretty well, is that in every conflict our country has ever fought, and really other countries as well, there's a basic courtesy, a basic human right that you allow the people on the other side of that conflict access to their dead. It doesn't matter how acrimonious the conflict was, how many lives were lost. It's been presumed to be a basic aspect of human rights for a long time that we provide our enemies, so to speak, that basic courtesy. When it really comes down to it, the U.S. government fought a war against a lot of the indigenous people in this country and removed them from their ancestral lands to places where they didn't necessarily have ancestral ties. And so to then add insult to injury by retrieving those remains, storing them away in facilities, and also removing the possibility for people to visit those places of their direct ancestors is really not a good thing. And I feel like tying it into that narrative seems to really drive the point home that this was a good thing in the end. It's something that we have afforded to even our greatest enemies in the history of our country. Why shouldn't we afford it to the indigenous people of North America?
These are great points. And so much, as you can imagine, as we get into this, revolves around not only the human rights, but the fact that so many Native Americans are so strongly tied to the land, especially ancestral lands of which they may have been moved off of. So what we're dealing here with is not just a legislative issue, but it's a cultural issue, and it's a land rights issue. There's so many things that are tied into here that you can imagine this is a very complex piece of legislation, and that's why we're doing this show. We really want to get into how it was crafted and some of the changes that have been implemented since that time, October 26, 1990, when it was first passed. So looking at the intention of the act, now that we have a better idea of pre-NAGPRA, the intention was for the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act to provide for the ownership or control of Native American cultural items. As we've mentioned here, that includes human remains, those things that are deemed culturally important, funerary objects, things of that nature. Any of those items that have been excavated or discovered on federal or tribal lands vests ownership or control of human remains and the associated funerary objects to either lineal descendants of the Native American, or if the lineal descendants cannot be ascertained, or the funerary objects and so forth are unassociated. So we're going to get into that word. You're going to hear that a lot tonight. Unassociated, in the Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization on whose land the remains or objects were located, or which has the closest cultural affiliation with the remains or objects. So what we're saying here is these items to be passed back to the tribal descendants. Now, as you can imagine, that is something that is much easier said than done when you get into the specifics of who was on what land at what time, who has rights to recognition from the federal government as a tribe. All of these things become very complex. And so we're going to try to do our best to sort through some of this tonight. Now, the idea that the intention is repatriation, that's the ultimate goal, is as both Bob and Spencer said, returning those remains to the rightful owners, those who want to reinter and honor their ancestors. Again, with the funerary objects, these are things that you may have seen on display in a museum setting, things that have been archived away in research facilities throughout the country, going through and doing inventory of these items so that they can be determined through the assistance of the tribal representatives that are claiming them as their ancestry, deciding which one of these objects are indeed funerary, are part of their culture. You can imagine this is not an easy task, and this is why it was passed in 1990, and we're just now in 2025 really beginning to see some major strides, if you will, in this department, because there's been combat along the way between institutions, between universities, between interpretation of much of this bill. So let's talk a little bit about allocations. So under NAGPRA, it allows the intentional removal from or excavation of Native American cultural items from federal or tribal lands. Again, this is not private property, but federal or tribal lands for discovery or study only with a permit and after consultation with, or in the case of tribal lands, the consent of the appropriate tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. So, of course, this brings up many questions, one of which is, how is the appropriate tribe determined? So, Dr. Kelly, I'll come back to you for your comments here. When we're looking at allocations and we've established that an institution, a university, whatever it is that receives federal funding, has these things in their possession, are required to inventory them, and then they confer with their appropriate tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. Once that's been established, is there ever an issue where we see competing tribes who both make a claim to an item? How do we go about establishing the appropriate path for these items to be passed to?
NAGPRA divides human remains into those that can be culturally affiliated with an existing federally recognized tribe or that can't be affiliated. And making that decision is not simple. They're not straightforward. Back when NAGPRA was first being written through its various pieces of legislation, there was a lot of discussion about maybe putting a time limit on the law. That is, it would only cover remains from the last 500 years or the last 1,000 years, because we know that as you go further back in time, it's harder to, link an 8 or 9,000 year old burial with an existing federally recognized tribe. That's just a very, very difficult thing to do. That proposal never got anywhere because they couldn't really decide on should it be 500 years, 1,000 years, and they decided that it could be different times in different parts of the country, and so better to go with cultural affiliation rather than having some arbitrary time limit on it. That of course made the job a little more difficult. A time limit would be very simple. You get a radiocarbon date, you're done. So cultural affiliation became very, very important to the law, establishing culture. That's very hard to do, especially if there are no funerary objects that can give us some clue as to what existing tribe this individual was linked to. So in making the inventories, institutions had to make a good faith effort to try and determine that. But it could also be worked out with the various tribes that might be culturally affiliated with the remains. It's a very difficult process, and it requires a lot of discussions among various tribes and about who this individual might be culturally affiliated with. It's one of the reasons that people have wondered why NAGPRA has taken so long. Why are there still human remains to be repatriated 35 years later? It's partly because the establishing cultural affiliation, it's not easy. It's not easy. Tribes may need to discuss this amongst themselves. Tribes generally don't want to tread on each other's toes, so those are kind of delicate discussions. And the archaeologist in charge of those human remains, wherever they're held, is the one who's sort of in the middle, making those decisions, coming to some agreement about it. And it's difficult for tribes because some tribes do not want the remains of individuals who are not their ancestors, and especially if those remains might be traditional enemies. There are other tribes that decided early on. The Zuni is one in the Southwest. They decided that, okay, you may establish that these individuals are Zuni, but we don't really want them back because we don't really have a ritual to deal with reinterring a burial. We don't have a ritual for that. I don't know if the Zuni still feel that way today. But early on, they did say, okay, fine, they're Zuni, but you guys hold them. So some people have said that NAGPRA requires repatriation. NAGPRA doesn't require repatriation. It requires that option be made available, but it doesn't demand that those things, that remains and vehicles are returned. It's really up to the tribe. This is the other reason why cultural affiliation was so important. Rather than some kind of blanket repatriation, because many tribes only wanted individuals that they were certain were their ancestors, and especially not the remains of their traditional enemies. So all of that takes, frankly, a great deal of of time. And those who have been critical of some institutions for not having repatriated everything need to understand this has been good faith effort on the part of the archaeologists, but it's a process that just takes time.
Yeah, well put. And Spencer, I'll bring it over to you here in just a moment. But again, as we're talking about NAGPRA, it's important to consider everything that Dr. Kelly just mentioned. There's so many facets to this. This can vary from region to region, from community to community, and state to state. There's a lot of considerations here. There's other people who have recently visited foreign nations, the United Kingdom, visited the British Museum and other institutions where they house Native American artifacts. And one of those repatriated. Keep in mind that NAGPRA does not affect foreign nations. So those items from the British Museum cannot and will not be repatriated under their own laws. So again, this is affecting federal lands, federally funded institutions here in the United States. Again, so many tribes, so many representatives, so many different ways of doing things that, again, there's no way to do this quickly. It takes a lot of conference. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of reaching out to the community tribes and getting their opinions, understanding their traditions, and understanding what's appropriate for them on their own cultural level. So, Dr. Pelton, we'll bring it to you for any of your thoughts concerning allocation of NAGPRA.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that, the concept of cultural affiliation and the idea that there's culturally unaffiliated remains. That was really how NAGPRA was carried out for about the first 2 decades of its existence. And that all kind of changed in 2010 with some major regulatory changes that happened there. And this might be a good time to kind of explain the difference between a law and a regulation and why implementation has changed so much since the beginning, since NAGPRA was first passed. Well, laws are passed by Congress, right? They're the culmination of, as Dr. Kelly said, years of debate and back and forth, bringing in as many voices to the process as you can, so that you actually land on a bipartisan consensus to pass this thing through 2 houses of Congress. It's an extremely laborious process, but it's also kind of consensus building at the largest scale, right? There's really no better example of consensus building than getting a law passed through 2 houses of Congress. It's tough to do. And for that reason, I think that's why NAGPRA was so robust. The concepts, the definitions, the requirements of that law had a lot of people weighing in on it and agreeing into it, buying into it. So let's contrast that with a different concept, which is regulation. So oftentimes regulations or Congress requires that regulations be promulgated by an executive branch agency. So what Congress will do is they'll pass a law and they'll say, like, here's the broad strokes of what we want to see happen. We're going to leave it up to executive branch agencies to actually figure out the nuances of the implementation, right? So what Congress did with NAGPRA was they kicked that down to the Department of the Interior to decide. So I think the first regulations for to implement NAGPRA came out in 1995, and since then they've been revised several times. And during one of those revisions, that concept of cultural affiliation was basically negated, for lack of a better word. People were frustrated with how long it was taking. We're trying to track down ancestors, trying to track down actually a living culture that's related to these ancestral myths. And so they came up with the concept of geographic affiliation instead, which effectively just said, these remains, any set of human remains that are found, we consider affiliated with whatever group of people was living in the geographic area where they were found in the historic area. So yeah, just to wrap that line of thinking up, this was a long process of change through the regulatory process as opposed to the law changing itself, right? The way that we do this has changed not because the law has changed. The law has stayed completely the same since 1990. It's the regulatory structure that the DOI promulgates that has changed since the law was passed.
Yeah, so that's important to recognize. Dr. Pelton, you mentioned requirements just a moment ago. So let's look at some of those again. The point here is for everyone to walk away today with a much clearer understanding of what NAGPRA is, where it came from, and how it's implemented. So the requirements state that any person who knowingly discovers Native American human remains, funerary or sacred objects, or objects of inalienable communal property on federal or tribal lands is to notify the federal entity authorized to manage such lands and the appropriate Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. Now, this requires such person, if the discovery is in connection with an activity, to cease that activity within the area of discovery, make a reasonable effort to protect those items, and provide notice to the tribe or organization. This permits the activity to resume after a reasonable amount of time after the notification has occurred. Now, this allows the governing body of an Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization to expressly relinquish control over any Native American human remains or title to or control over any funeral or sacred object. So again, there's a lot of language there that a lot of people have sort of picked apart, and it is, I think, necessary to explore a little bit further. One of those words, Dr. Pelton, that I've seen people kind of hit on in articles, people who are opposed to this, to NAGPRA as a whole, rather, they often focus on the word sacred, a sacred object. You know, that's often considered a subjective term. Well, who decides what's sacred? Who decides if it's sacred? How do we decide? Is there a history that we can go back and refer to that says that something is a funerary object, says that something is a sacred object? How do you determine what's a sacred site? On and on and on. People who go in and hit on those key words. So let's talk about the idea of some of these funerary and sacred objects and how they can be delineated. What does that process look like? So in the event of a federally funded organization, a museum, academic institution who's going through and trying to make heads or tails of a collection that they have, they're doing that inventory as is required. And someone who may be a tribal representative says, you know, in our tribe, this particular item is considered sacred because of X, Y, and Z. Is it required that they confirm that in any greater detail than the tribal representative? And what's some of the controversy we've seen surrounding such statements?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, the great thing about laws is that you have to define terms, and both of those terms, funerary object and sacred object, are defined very specifically in NAGPRA. I'm looking at it now. So sacred object, specific ceremonial object, which is needed by traditional Native American religious leaders for the practice of religions by their present day adherents. As far as I'm, at least in implementation right now, no, there's not any documentation that's required to be provided for that. Now, given where NAGPRA came from and where it is today, I think that the distinction has changed a lot. It was a lot easier to make that distinction in 1990 than it is now. There were specific sacred objects that the people who drafted NAGPRA had in mind, and they provided examples. And when you look at some of the justification for the law, there's things, for instance, like taken out of caves in Hawaii, where there were these pilgrimage sites, and there was these wooden totems in caves, and clearly settlers in Hawaii just stole them away back to the mainland, basically. I will say funerary objects is very specifically defined as well, right? It's objects that, as part of a death rite or ceremony, are reasonably believed to have been placed with individual humans either at the time of death or later. Again, that's it was a very easy thing to determine in 1990 when this was passed. Everyone was in the same room talking about this stuff. In their minds, I think the definition was very clear. So based on archaeological context, you could determine what a funerary object was and was not. I think since then, it's become a little less clear what those actually are based on some of these regulatory changes that I've referred to.
It's all there. You just have to really dig in and define these terms because, as we've mentioned, this is an extremely complex piece of legislation, something that is still in flux and will continue to see revisions as we move forward. Now, federal agencies and museums, this has really been the focus of the majority of the controversy because you're dealing with agencies and museums, places that are displaying these items for profit. They depend on tourists. They depend on telling the story of a certain area, certain region. This is only dealing with institutions that are receiving federal funding, but that's a lot. That's a lot of your major facilities. That's a lot of your more prestigious museums throughout the country and academic institutions who have museums on campus and things of such nature. That's a lot to be affected. And it says it directs federal agencies and museums with possession or control over holdings or collections of Native American human remains and funerary objects to inventory them. I'm going to stop right there for a second before I complete the remainder of this, because that process of inventory in itself has been something that's really held up NAGPRA, because many of these institutions have thousands of items. They don't always have the staff on hand to really be able to process a lot of this. And there's also been blowback from some of these institutions who don't feel that they should have to, or that they use certain terms to say that these items don't fall under cultural association, so on and so forth. So Dr. Kelly, I'll begin with you this time. When we're looking at federal agencies and museums, academic institutions, other places that are required to inventory these items, how would an institution with a very large collection begin to even address such an issue?
Well, most institutions had to go out and hire someone who would be tasked with doing exactly that. The University of Wyoming did, and big museums did. It was going to take more than one person to really do the inventory properly. It wasn't like all this material was sitting in one room and all you had to do was walk in and basically, write it all down. It's spread throughout collections. Some of it might have been unknown that it was even existed in a museum. Some of these museums, like the American Museum of Natural History, they have huge holdings, and that, to be honest, they don't know what they have in there. Much of it, yes, they know, but they don't know everything that they have in there. Over the years, stuff has crept in that never got into any kind of register. So the inventory itself was not a simple matter. And yeah, you've got thousands and thousands of objects, and then you have to make decisions about, are they funerary objects? Are they objects of cultural patrimony? Yeah, that's not a simple process. It was going to take more than a weekend. So it has taken a long time, and then trying to figure out cultural affiliation, communicating with a lot of different tribes, that all very time-consuming process, and it requires an institution to devote resources or find additional resources to hire the people to do that.
Yeah, so you can imagine, again, with these large institutions, many times some of these collections came in the 1800s, early 1900s. A lot of these things haven't been seen in literally decades. Journals, associated reports from the field, all of these things may be missing, may be incomplete, may have redactions. So you can imagine moving through all of these pieces can be quite a challenge. Dr. Pelton, I'll come to you with this next part. Something that I've also ran into is the fact that in many cases, some of these items have been presented to tribal representatives, in which case the representatives simply said, I don't know. I don't know what that is. I've never seen anything quite like that, and I don't know if it is a funerary object. I don't even know if that would be associated with our culture. So how would an institution, a university, someone in that position move forward with an item that they basically can't classify? They don't know if it's actually associated with the people from that region. They don't know what the implementation of it may have been. And in some of these cases where the records are missing, we don't know what context it may have been found in the first place. So this is just one of the many challenges that someone dealing with NAGPRA would be required to deal with. What are your thoughts on that?
It's obviously got to be taken on a case-by-case basis. You make a good point that, we tend to think of these museums and repositories as having these immaculate records of provenance, and we know exactly where this came from. It came from this great excavation that the WPA did, and we have detailed field notes. That is not the case at all for most institutions. And so you do run into these cases where you have a weird thing, and there's some rumors about where it came from, say like, oh, so and so's grandpa brought this in, 1910. He said he found it in a rock crevice in this county somewhere. And there's all these kind of rumors about an object, but no real definitive information about it. In my view, the best way to deal with that stuff, if you do have a reason to believe that it could be a funerary object or something like that, is just start talking to the tribes about it. If they don't know either, then it goes back in your collection. I mean, I feel like that's a pretty simple answer, actually. This is not there is no defined end goal, as Bob was saying. Like, if you go through the process, if you do the work of putting a good faith effort in and trying to figure this stuff out, then you've fulfilled the mandates of the law. And if you still don't have answers at the end of that, then that's just the way it is, basically. You've gone through the process, and the process is, I think, structured, or traditionally was structured, in order to really suss these ambiguous cases out, so that if there is a chance of solving them, then you can. But it's not always possible. You should also note, like, individual, like, finger bones and teeth and just random human bones are a lot more common in a lot of these collections than people think. A lot of human remains are just individual, say, ribs or whatever that are found out in the prairie or eroding out of a cut bank or something. And they truly have, you really don't even know if it's an indigenous remain or not, right? In the absence of destructive testing. And grappling with those things actually is a much bigger part of the process than I think people that don't do it recognize. Just these random bits and pieces of both human remains and material culture that somehow end up in these facilities, and then you got to scratch your head for a while figuring out what to do with them.
Yeah, so many great points there. I do want to hit on what we call the gray areas of cultural items, just a little bit for clarification. As Dr. Pelton just said, it's case by case. There's so many things that can happen here. Again, human remains are pretty clear-cut physical remains of a Native American. If it was taken from a mound site, if it was taken from a burial, somewhere that can be obviously associated with a Native American site, I think that's pretty clear-cut. Funerary objects, these are generally items that are placed near or on human remains as part of a death rite, a particular ceremony, something that was found in context with a burial. So that can be many things. It could be a projectile point. It could be a special piece of jewelry. It could be many, many things, but it's essentially something that's found in a burial. Sacred objects, again, these are needed for modern practice of Native traditional religions. So if it can be recognized that, this is similar to something that we still use today, or we know what this was used for, this is how it was implemented, that seems to be appropriate enough to determine that as a sacred object. Cultural patrimony, group-owned objects having ongoing importance to the group. So whether that is a statue, some piece of petroglyph or artwork, something that is meaningful to a culture as a whole, falls under that category. Now, the gray areas of these cultural items, as we've just discussed, is who decides what a cultural item is. I think we've established pretty easily that the tribal members, I think that can be expressed in a very clear-cut manner. Who designates what a sacred object is? Again, if someone's telling you that this is very similar to something that we use today, I think that's pretty clear-cut as well. What is needed to determine cultural association? Now, we've kind of covered this. We've talked about this, the different ways of doing that, the different ways of making that connection. Now, where some pushback has been felt with NAGPRA is those who worry that these items are just being handed over to someone who's claiming that they are something that they may not necessarily be. Again, I think this is a good faith effort, giving the benefit of the doubt if you have a tribal representative coming out to speak to you. But I'll give the experts here a chance to speak on this. So Dr. Pelton, establishing that tribal association, establishing a chain of custody from the item leaving a facility into the hands of the tribal members, what does that kind of look like in a real life scenario?
Well, it has a lot to do with the Federal Register. So the Federal Register is this really boring newspaper, basically, that the government publishes every day, and it basically covers the actions of the executive branch primarily. So every time a new regulation comes out, or every time the executive branch takes some drastic action, it gets published in the Federal Register, and basically all of NAGPRA business is done through that. It has to be public. So really the first step in that's the notice of inventory completion. Once you've kind of done some consultation, you've identified objects that you think might be subject to NAGPRA, you compile a list of those things, you summarize it in this notice of inventory completion, and then you publish it in the National Register. At that time, tribes that you've identified as potentially having interest in those objects can file claims for them. Once those claims come in, you decide everything, you do a notice of disposition, which is basically we're notifying everybody that we're repatriating this stuff. And then it's basically up to the tribes to come and get it. If these things are stored in a human remains repository, some representatives, typically from the tribal historic preservation offices, will come and they'll maybe do a little ceremony and pack the stuff up and take it back to wherever their lands are. That's what the process looks like.
Sure.
I did want to talk about a little bit. You started out this question talking about conflicts between identifying these things. I'll just say that increasingly so, there's been conflicts between sources of information that identify things as cultural items, not human remains. Obviously, human remains are pretty obvious, but there's been a lot of conflicts in between various sources of knowledge in identifying cultural items. And by cultural items, I mean sacred objects, funerary objects, and objects of cultural patrimony. You have people on one side, archaeologists, historians, people that have kind of an empirically minded way of viewing the world. They look at archaeological evidence, they look at context, they look at provenance of objects and archaeological site reports, and they have their own view of what is and is not a cultural item based on that context, based on the documentation that archaeologists have undertaken. And the other side of that, you have some Native American groups who say, well, we disagree. These things are cultural items or sacred objects or the funerary objects. And so you're left in this place where you have to come to a consensus somehow. And really that conflict is a result of, in my mind, it's two major regulatory changes that have occurred to NAGPRA since 2010. And again, this is the Department of the Interior making these regulatory changes. Effectively, these regulations are federal law. There's penalties associated with them. You can be investigated and fined based on violations of those regulations. So by all intents and purposes, they are law. And it's law that's basically written by a couple people at the Department of the Interior through this rulemaking process. So the first major regulatory change to NAGPRA, really since it passed, was in 2010. There's a big revision of the NAGPRA regulations, and that revision was basically in response to the Bonnichsen case, or more commonly known as the Kennewick Man case. With Kennewick, scientists felt like that they were entitled to access to that set of human remains for research because, in their view, it could not reasonably be culturally affiliated with modern living people. It was 8,000 years old. There was, in their view, really no way to link those remains to a living group of people. And ultimately, the courts agreed with archaeologists on that. And archaeologists won that case and won the right to research those remains. So archaeologists won that battle, that court battle, but the war, not so much, because the response by the Department of the Interior to the Bonnichsen case was to revise NAGPRA's implementing regulations to come up with this concept of geographic affiliation, which I referred to earlier. And what geographic affiliation basically did was negate the existence of unaffiliated human remains. So if you can't reasonably link a set of human remains to a modern living people based on archaeological evidence or any other lines of evidence, you just defer to the geography. Where was it found and what tribe was living there historically? And then you say, all right, these remains are geographically affiliated with this group. And so there's a connection there and they can be subjected to NAGPRA on that basis. So that was a big change because up until this point, museums and other institutions had solely been investing their efforts in making these cultural affiliations and repatriating those sets of human remains. And it was a lot. It was tens of thousands of human remains, if not much, many more than that, that were affiliated before that. But once those regulations passed, they then had to go back to their collections and start doing geographic affiliation. Again, a process that's going to take a really long time. And so there was this second wave of human remains repatriation starting in about 2010, where all these old remains, these are typically very old remains, right? Like things older than a couple thousand years at least, that were previously deemed unaffiliated human remains. Those were now drawn into the NAGPRA process for the first time, and there was this big push to repatriate all that stuff in 2010. So that was the first big change. The second big change happened 1 year ago, January 24, but the regulations had kind of gone through some review before that. And that set of regulatory changes, we could talk about probably for the rest of this conversation. I'll just suffice it to say right now that it was more or less a complete revision, not of just the regulations, but in my view, it went so far as to revise the intent of the law itself, that they're so far removed from NAGPRA as it originally existed in 1990 and was passed by Congress.
Okay, and this is a part of the conversation where we begin to talk about the fluidity of this, the changes, the things that can happen. And what Dr. Pelton is specifically referring to, I'll read here verbatim. On December 6, 2023, the DOI announced updates to NAGPRA with their revisions going into effect on January 12, 2024. Now, the NAGPRA revisions have been touted as, quote, strengthening the authority and role of the indigenous communities in the repatriation process with an aim toward accelerating the repatriation process. One of the primary goals of the update was to address the exclusion of tribal voices by increasing tribal access and involvement in the repatriation process. To that end, the revision sought to increase transparency and reporting of museum collections, as well as require museums to obtain consent from tribes before exhibiting any human remains. Additionally, the update eliminated one of the biggest loopholes of the original regulation, the, quote, culturally unidentifiable category. Since 1990, museums had designated thousands of remains and objects as culturally unidentifiable, a label for when the museum is unable to identify one of those tribal objects or lineal descent for repatriation. It falls within that category. It goes on to say, however, museums often resorted to this designation too quickly or without sufficient research, allowing the museum to keep the remains or objects in perpetuity and leaving the repatriation in legal limbo. Under the new regulation, museums and other institutions can no longer use this culturally unidentifiable category as a catch-all loophole to avoid repatriation. Dr. Kelly, I want to bring the conversation to you. To what degree was this culturally unidentifiable category being used? Was it significant enough across institutions for it to be addressed as it was here in these updates to NAGPRA?
In my experience, that category, culturally unaffiliated, which admittedly covered about 75% of the human remains and objects that were listed in the inventories. In my experience, it was not used as a loophole. It was the genuine conclusion of the individuals responsible for compiling the inventories that they could not do it. They could not culturally affiliate these remains, which, as Spencer pointed out, are generally the much older remains. I don't think it was a loophole. I don't think that there was something nefarious going on. It was archaeologists being honest about what they could and could not say. And archaeologists tend to be, in terms of their interpretation of the archaeology, we tend to be fairly conservative. I don't mean politically conservative. I mean scientifically conservative, and not say, here's what something is, unless we can really say, this is what it is. We otherwise have to admit that, well, it could be Shoshone, it could be Kiowa, it could be Arapaho. We honestly can't give you a good answer. I don't think it was a loophole, and if those regulations were written to crack down on these individuals who had found a loophole, that's simply not true. Not in my experience. And had talked with many people about NAGPRA and doing inventories and the problems that arise. And I get the sense that they were all doing the work in good faith, but being honest about what they could and could not say with certainty.
Yeah, I'll just add, I really resented that the media coverage of these changes, presenting it as a loophole. I mean, there's a central feature of the legislation, and to characterize it as a loophole, really, it implies that museums and archaeologists were just kind of sneakily trying to find ways to usurp the legislation. And like Bob says, that's just not my experience at all. I think at least everybody that I know I'm sure there's bad actors out there, but everyone I know that has done this for a long time really put a good faith effort into identifying the cultures of these remains. And if they couldn't, they're not going to lie about it, which is essentially what you would have to do to I guess, not exploit this loophole in the eyes of some of the media commentators that weighed in on these regulatory changes.
Yeah, and that's why I wanted to give you both an opportunity to speak on this, because it didn't sit well with me either. It has that underlying accusatory tone as someone's trying to get away with something, but to what end? Anthropologists, archaeologists, they study these things, these cultures with a love and a passion. So what was to be gained by trying to loophole their way out of it? So again, I appreciate the fact that you both spoke to that. I do want to discuss as a final point here tonight some of the guidelines for determining that cultural affiliation, because they have been laid out under these revisions. So let's take a look at those. First is cultural affiliation is based on a reasonable connection determined by available information provided by an Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. As we've discussed here, I think that's reasonable. I think that's a reasonable approach. Somebody who is a representative or several representatives coming out to speak with the institutions and plead their case as to why these items are meaningful and what cultural affiliation they have. I think that would be fairly easy to determine. The second bullet point here is confirms that cultural affiliation. Now we're getting a little bit into that gray area again. It's one thing to say it, it's another thing to confirm it. So how do we go about that? Next, it does not require exhaustive studies or additional research. Now, as we move into this area, this is where some of the pushback has came. I've seen people within the world of archaeology and anthropology starting to raise an eyebrow as we get into some of this. So I'm going to read them all off and then we'll go back and discuss them. So again, does not require exhaustive studies or additional research, does not require continuity through time, is not precluded solely because of reasonable gaps in the information available, and a museum, federal agency, or other agency must undertake 3 steps to determine cultural affiliation. The first being collect information, second, identify required criteria, and finally, make a determination of cultural affiliation. Now, again, much of this seems subjective. We mentioned earlier that a good faith effort is put forth to try to make these determinations. But when it comes to law, specifically government, federal law, we don't see a lot of wiggle room, generally speaking, in most acts and laws as they are prescribed. So I want to go back and talk a little bit about some of these. The ones that are listed here for guidelines for determining cultural affiliation that I've seen the biggest blowback from have been does not require exhaustive studies or additional research and does not require continuity through time. So let's talk a little bit about those. Is this enough for everyone who's involved in this to make those determinations, or is there another way that we think should be required for these determinations to be made? We're not saying what's right or wrong. We're just discussing it here. Dr. Pelton, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I commented on that. Does not require additional studies in my public comment on these regs. I don't know how you're supposed to do this process without doing a little bit of studying, I guess. I don't understand even really what that means, other than I guess you're just supposed to kind of like hold your nose and and push these things away and not open a book or like do any kind of like homework on establishing this stuff. It just seems like an extraordinarily careless piece of guidance to be in federal regulations, where you're essentially just saying, don't do any of that booky stuff. We're just going to get this done. I will say, in practice, in my experience in practice, people don't even really do any of that anymore. They defer specifically to the geographic affiliation thing. So there's maps. The NAGPRA office manages these maps that have polygons drawn on them that show ancestral territories of the tribal nations of North America. And so you take that map, you figure out where the human remains or cultural items are from, you put that dot on the map, and whatever tribal territories overlap that dot, those are the ones you talk to. So you don't really do anything beyond that in practice at this point. There's no kind of looking at, maybe there's certain artifacts, certain types of adornments that are more common among one group of people than another. You don't consider that. You don't consider anything. You just consider geography at this point. So in practice, that section is just not. It's not even really all that relevant in my mind anymore. I don't see people really moving through that process at all. Yeah, maybe you'll get here. The thing I really want to talk about in this episode is the definition changes to funerary objects in the new regulations.
Well, that's a great place to pick it up. So we'll move there next. It's one thing I do want to mention here is when we're talking about geographic location, many cases, such as in the Ohio area, Kentucky area, places like that, closer to where I'm at, many tribal affiliations only go back to the 1600s. They may have only moved into that area in the 1600s. Therefore, anything prior to that is, in all honesty, not related to any of those tribes. And they'll tell you that in many cases, not every case. So again, as you can see, there's many, many layers here. There's a lot to consider. And there's, again, this is why this has moved so slowly. And again, that has been one of the big criticisms, and not fast enough. But well, you got to think about all of these factors and all of the considerations that have to be made. Dr. Kelly, before we move on to those definitions that Dr. Pelton mentioned, kind of has our final talking point for the evening. Is there anything that you would like to add to the conversation of the guidelines for determining cultural affiliation?
I'm sorry, I'm going to say no.
I understand completely, and we'll leave it at that. So we'll take it back to Dr. Pelton to kind of drive home our final points tonight. Dr. Pelton will pick up the conversation with your concerns over these definitions, and this will be our wrap point for this particular episode tonight. So I'll turn it over to you now.
I think these regulations made a lot of changes in process, and they instated timelines. They expanded who was subject to NAGPRA pretty considerably in terms of federal funding. So like all coroners' offices now, for instance, subject to NAGPRA. They did a lot of stuff. It was a pretty radical change in how this process was done. But I think the most substantive change for archaeologists specifically is the definition changes for cultural items that occurred in these recent regulations. So, these definitions were laid out in the original Act of Congress pretty specifically. I read some of them earlier. Funerary objects, objects connected to a death rite placed near a person at their time of death or shortly thereafter. But in the new regulation changes, they actually changed the congressionally defined definitions for these things. And what they did was they tacked on this one phrase at the end of all the definitions. It says, a funerary object, for instance, is any object connected either at the time of death or later to a death rite or ceremony of a Native American culture, quote, according to the Native American traditional knowledge of a lineal descendant Indian tribe or Native Hawaiian organization. So that little change, tacking on that according to a Native American tribe, has just fundamentally altered the way NAGPRA's done in this country. because what's the way some people are interpreting that phrase, that addition to the definitions, is that we no longer have to consider any other sources of information when making these decisions. We don't have to consult archaeology. We don't have to consult history, linguistics, geography, any of the sources of information that we traditionally consulted to make these calls, to go through this process. Many are interpreting this, not all, I say, but many people are interpreting these new regulations to suggest that it's not up to any of that anymore. It's solely up to what your individual consultant has to say about it. I think that has resulted in a pretty unfair balance of voices in this process. I think it's resulting in some pretty destructive practices that everybody, tribes and archaeologists alike, will probably regret about 10 years down the line.
I get that impression. My major concern with this is, even though it's often touted as moving very slowly, I have felt that as a whole, it may have been getting ahead of itself. So much of repatriation, things that have happened in a rush, can't be undone. So this is something that requires incredible amount of focus, dedication, investigation, and I don't think it should be taken lightly. With that being said, much of the concern with these new definitions for some is going too far. And again, this is much of this is subjective. It's your opinion. It's how do you see it? How do you read it? How do you interpret it? How is the best practice in your region with the tribal members that are present? Because one area may be very successful in many ways of processing NAGPRA, where another area may have combativeness, pushback, disagreement between tribes. So there is no one-size-fits-all legislation, which has been one of the issues with NAGPRA from the very beginning. As it continues to be implemented, we will discuss case studies. This will not be the only episode. In the following episode, we will be looking more at how NAGPRA is affecting museum studies, archaeology, and anthropology in 2025 and for the future. So we're going to be looking at what is the future of archaeology, what is the future of relationships with our Native American representatives, with our tribes, with our members. Much to consider and much to take in when you're discussing something this large and sweeping across the entire nation. Is it a one-size-fits-all approach, or does it need more refinement? Those are all the things that we're going to talk about. I want to give both of my guests an opportunity tonight to make a final statement on everything that we've discussed up to this point, and we look forward to future conversations on a very complex and very intricate piece of legislation that has been here since 1990, but we're really seeing the headlines here in 2025. I'll start with Dr. Kelly. Any final words on NAGPRA and everything that we've discussed here tonight from you?
I've long told my students that the way we do archaeology is linked to why we do archaeology. Why study the past? Who cares what happened 1,000, 5,000, 10,000, 100,000 years ago? Why should we really care? And I think we should care because archaeology is one of the records, and for many time periods, it's the only record we have of how humans have put themselves together, how they've chosen to be human, how they have organized themselves. It's the longest record we have of what effect do changes in diet have, in changes in how humans put themselves together. What creates war, which is not a continual state of humanity, although it might seem that way. How do men and women relate to each other? It's the longest record we have of people. And we study it not just out of idle curiosity or morbid fascination with the dead. We study it in order to understand ourselves. And we want to understand ourselves in order, I presume, to continue to make human life better, more pleasant, more fair, more just. If in the process of doing that, I implicitly say that, your concerns with the past don't matter, get lost. And there was a time when probably archaeologists might have felt that way about indigenous peoples. We're the scientists, we're in charge, we know what's important, and you guys don't. Well, that just undermines, in my opinion, any reason for doing archaeology. You've made the world a worse place, not a better place. So NAGPRA and paying attention to these concerns is really essential, because otherwise I'm a hypocrite and I've undermined any reason for the scientific work that I do. At the same time, if we lose the record, if it's gone, we can't do archaeology and we can't benefit from this long record of human act. So we've got a tightrope there that we're walking. That's not going to be easy, and no one should expect it to be easy. And it can't be resolved with some simple rules that do away with the conversation that NAGPRA created, and that, quite honestly, was very, very good for the science of archaeology, oddly enough.
Yeah, beautifully put. And Dr. Kelly, I think what you hit on there is so vitally important. The conversation is the most important part, and we don't want to get ahead of that by making rash choices now that can't be undone. The conversation, the relationship, I think, is the most important part here. I'll turn it over to Dr. Spencer Pelton for a final word tonight on this part 1 episode on NAGPRA. Dr. Pelton.
I think the thing I want to drive home is, this conversation has been getting increasingly heated during the past several years. And I think for people that are more activist minded, they've really painted this issue as being either pro-NAGPRA or anti-NAGPRA, or by extension, pro-indigenous or anti-indigenous. And it's just kind of escalated and grown increasingly more severe in its tone. I'd like to convey that you don't have to choose one or the other. And personally, the place I've landed in is that I'm pro-NAGPRA. I'm very critical of the regulations that have been used to implement NAGPRA, because I think that they've been irresponsibly handled by the Department of the Interior. And there's plenty of space like that. You can be all for the original intent of the law and the law itself, but be very critical of the way the DOI has handled it since the law was passed. And I feel pretty comfortable sitting in that position. I would encourage other people to at least consider that position as well. You don't have to have the same opinions as the two people in Washington, D.C. that wrote these regulations. There's plenty of room for disagreement there. But the way that this conversation has played out publicly the last several years, there really hasn't been much room for conversation. And I would like to see that change.
Again, brilliantly put. That's what we're here to do. That's why 7AGES Audio Journal exists, and that's why we're having this conversation. I want to encourage everyone who's listening to this conversation, write in jason@7ages.org. Let me know what you think about this. Give me your thoughts, your opinion. Make sure that it is clear and concise. And the idea is, how do we move forward with this in the best way possible? How do we make the most of these regulations? How do we keep that conversation going and making sure that the right thing is being done? I've heard some best practices from across the nation from different areas. I've heard some really encouraging things, and I've heard some very discouraging things. So let's keep the conversation going. Again, we will have additional episodes based around NAGPRA. I want to thank both of my guests, Dr. Kelly and Dr. Pelton. I want to thank you both for joining me here on the 7AGES Audio Journal for this very special edition, and we hope to hear from you again in the future.
Thank you, Jeff.
Again, I want to thank both Spencer and Professor Kelly for joining us. Both of these gentlemen have taken the time. We did a lot of preparation for this leading into this episode, so we hope that everyone has a better understanding of this. Again, they're stepping up, taking the time to explain all the fine details of how this works, the experiences that they've had with NAGPRA personally, and hopefully this will open up conversation. So again, if anybody has any comments, questions, or anything they would like to relay to us here at the show, you can always reach out to us at our respective emails, Jason at James or Micah at 7ages.org, and we'd be happy to get back to you with that. So again, a big thanks to both Spencer Pelton and Robert Kelly.
Excellent. Yeah, thank you very much for that. Always an important discussion to be had when it comes to the work of archaeologists and the field of archaeology. Gentlemen, here in the next couple of days, I'm going to be traveling, and then I'm going to be working, and then I'm going to be doing some more work, and I'm hoping to be able to have enough time for a very important excavation next week that I'll be engaging in, and that will be the excavation of my dinner plate at Thanksgiving dinner. Despite my insane schedule, I look forward to some time with family, and since you guys are honorary family members of mine, I want to wish you both a very happy Thanksgiving. I want to wish all of our listeners out there happy holidays whenever you may be listening to this, and of course we always appreciate you being here and being a part of what we do here at the Cross Time Pub via the 7 Ages Research Associates. So gentlemen, shall we go ahead, pony up, and have one more round right here at the famous bar?
Let's do it, as always.
This sounds splendid indeed. So one more for the road on behalf of Jason Pentrail, James Waldo, and yours truly, I am Micah Hanks. Don't forget to check us out online at 7ages.org and to check out that Patreon. You'll find a link right there on the website as well. Happy holidays, friends, and we'll be seeing you again here in short order as we resume functions at the Cross Time Pub. As always, we'll see you somewhere out there in time when we return right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.